That's how far back. That's how far back my work in the historic Connecticut conference went. It's good to be with all of you today. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the beautiful worship. Thank you for creating a space to encounter the divine so beautifully this morning in sacrament and liturgy and the voices of children, the joyful spirit that was in the sanctuary this morning. Just thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was lovely to be with you. I'm going to start off quickly by introducing you to the center a little bit, just so you know where I'm coming from and the resources that we offer. And then we're going to go into a little bit of an understanding of the church in changing times and the church in shifting cultural landscape. So we'll talk about that a little bit this morning. I have some statistics for you. I will mention some research areas where you can do some more you can do a deeper dive yourselves into some of the recent scholarship that's out there statistically and some of the data that's been collected. The most recent studies that have been done pretty much are from 2020, so I will be quoting research this morning from during pandemic times, which obviously has some impact, but not necessarily the negative impact that you would think. So I will just say that as I prepare my comments, and without further ado, let me introduce you to the Center for Transformational Leadership. We are a small but mighty team of 3. That's the center. Our director, Reverend Heather Ramsey Mabrouk, is also the director of a 5-year clergy development initiative that has been an ecumenical opportunity for clergy to deepen and grow their skills and capabilities that has been funded by a Lilly Endowment grant. And so TWT, Together We Thrive, has 3 ecumenical partners, the Southern New England Conference, United Church of Christ, that's where I'm from, and also the New England Synod of the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and also the Western Diocese of the Episcopal Church in Massachusetts. So those are our 3 partners, and we're just winding up that 5-year Lilly grant. It will be completed at the end of December, and the initiatives in that were coaching. So we did coach training for clergy through the ICF, and coaching for clergy, which is its own organization. And we have trained and developed a number of clergy coaches who can be deployed to go out to congregations and work both with pastoral leaders and also small groups of folks within the congregation. So coaching is a really good way to lean in and to learn. It brings wonder and curiosity to the moment. And so coaching, and it brings out the wisdom from within and the wisdom in the room. So coaching is a very good is a really good tool. We've also had affinity groups, which are learning groups. Those are intentional learning groups, and affinity groups are focused on particular areas of development. So we've had clergy groups for clergy, affinity groups for clergy of color, affinity groups for retirees, for retired clergy, for LGBTQIA folks, for new clergy, for spiritual direction for clergy, and a number of others. And so that's TWT. Now, Heather's also the director of the Center for Transformational Leadership, and when the grant ends, when the Lilly grant ends, some of those resources are going to come into the Center for Transformational Leadership. So hence, she's the director for both initiatives currently, and when Together We Thrive sunsets or moves to sustainability in a new way, she will be helping to oversee some of that longer sustainability through the Center for Transformational Leadership. We began June 1st, 2021. We're not that old. We were formed of the innovation team of the conference. And so the idea was to have many of the resources in transformational leadership, leadership development, and transformative work for congregations in one setting. And so that's the center. And this is our mission statement. To equip clergy and lay leaders, congregations, and covenantal partners of the SNEUCC to do the transformative ministry you are called to do in the local church, in the local community, and in the world. So there you are. This is how you find us. You can go to sneucc.org and go to the purple box, and you can find resources from the Center for Transformational Leadership there. Or you can just put in your browser sneucc.org/transform, and you'll get to the same page. But if you're going from the purple block, you're going to click on that. These are the 4 guiding values and principles of the Southern New England Conference. And then you're going to click that purple box in the top left-hand corner. So that's and this is the landing page. So this is what you'll see, our mission statement on the top. And then as you scroll down, you'll see that there are, and I don't think I included that slide for this morning, but you'll see that there are 6 different categories of resources to look for through the center. Go ahead, Craig, thank you. So one of the programs that we're really excited about that gets a lot of play is we have a monthly lunch and learn on the 3rd Thursday of the month from 12 to 1 p.m. And these are actually free to anyone because they are sponsored through the generosity of our many churches' proportional giving. And so these are bite-sized engagements. You know, there are 40 to 45-minute workshops with about 15 minutes for conversation on the various topics of the church in changing landscape and church in changing times, of what transformation looks like, all the various topics that people are interested in, knowing that the work of the church today is different than it was in the modern era. We are in the postmodern time. And so, so these topics, things like coming up in April, go ahead, Craig, I think I have it actually as a slide. Coming up in April, on the 3rd Thursday of April, we have Reverend Dr. Jerry Streets, who is the senior pastor of Dixwell Avenue Church in Hamden, Connecticut, and also is a leader at and teaches at Yale Divinity School. Dr. Streets did some research during pandemic times on clergy well-being, and so he's going to do a report out, but the title of the presentation is Caring Congregations, What the Pandemic is Teaching Us, because we know for clergy to survive and thrive, congregations have to survive and thrive as well. And so Jerry's going to be helping us to understand the impact of the pandemic on all of us, including our clergy. The May Lunch and Learn is on local church ministry and public leadership, and that's going to be hosted and led by Reverend Dan Smith, who is the senior minister at First Congregational Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he's going to help us to think about some good strategies for being out in the community and out in the world and being our best advocates for the issues that matter to us and living our values in the world and in the community. So those are the next 2. And then the season will end and we'll start up again in September. So just to let you know, it's a program year season for Lunch and Learn from September right through May. But I'm here to talk to you this morning and talk with you this morning about the church in changing and challenging times. Because we are people of faith, I always start with scripture and prayer, and I would appreciate the grace to do that with you this morning as well. This morning's passage is taken from Jeremiah 29, verse 11. Go ahead, Craig, thank you. I know the plans I have in mind for you, declares the Lord. They are plans for peace, not disaster, to give you a future filled with hope. As we began doing our assessment and discernment work and work with congregations at the threshold of their life cycle in 2021 through the Center for Transformational Leadership, we found a beautiful prayer by Beth Richardson, who writes for Upper Room. It's called Bless This Journey, and since this morning's theme in some ways touched on journey and the continuing journey that we all have, I think I heard that invitation several times from Allison in her prayer and in her words. I'm going to ask you to pray with me this prayer for this journey of churches and people of faith at this time. So will you pray with me? We stand at the threshold and look behind us at all that we've done and all that we've loved, at all that is familiar, and our hearts fill with grief, with sadness, and with gratitude. We stand at the threshold and look before us at the future we can and cannot see, at the beginnings we can and cannot imagine, at the possibilities we can and cannot know, and our hearts fill with fear, with trust, and with hope. Bless our grief and our gratitude, O God, our sadness and our trust, our fear and our hope. Bless this journey, God of past and future. Guide our steps, walking beside us, before us, within us, as we step across this threshold. The key question congregations are asking themselves in this time and this space is, what is God's preferred future for our church? Because we believe, as people of faith, that God has a plan for each faith community. And it may look very different than the faith community down the street or the 1-2 towns over, but we believe with hope that God has a preferred future for each congregation and each community of faith. But we know that communities of faith have had to be resilient and flexible and relevant and do many things in the postmodern time of church, in the postmodern era, that they didn't do in the modern era when the attractional model was at its peak. When all we had to do were put out the right signs, have the right people greeting, open our doors on Sunday morning, have a clean and inviting space, and they would come. And those times are no longer. But churches are relevant. Faith communities are relevant. Churches are finding their place. They are discerning their own unique calls. And they are doing what God's calling them to do in this time and this place. And we're going to talk about that a bit. So we're going to talk about the shifting landscape for a moment of church and culture. We know that opportunity is born of crisis, and this was beautifully demonstrated during the pandemic in so many of our congregations. We were the beneficiaries of a Louisville grant through Reverend Dr. Audrey Price, who's a former executive of the Southern New England United Church of Christ. And with that Louisville grant, the idea was to mark time, mark space, mark ministry and ministry that matters through the pandemic. And so a project was born called the Resiliency Time Capsule. And we have one beautiful video for you to watch. It's about an hour long. You can break it into 4 segments that are 13 to 18 minutes long. And those 4 segments are categorized. But basically what that video does is it documents the flexibility, the resilience, the response of congregations during the pandemic. And it's not just about moving to live-streamed worship and from in-person worship to virtual worship or to hybrid worship. There's so many other ways in which churches responded to the needs of their community, both within the church and especially outside the doors of the church during a time when our ability to be physically with one another was limited, when we were concerned about our health, and those concerns remain. I'll talk about some research later that tells us very clearly that those concerns remain. But this beautiful time capsule project also has various study guides. And it's inspiring. These stories are hope-filled. They are testimonies of churches doing amazing things and using their gifts and their reserves during a challenging time. And so if you want some inspiration about what matters and what matters to people on behalf of the faith community, you have only to watch that hour-long video or any of those 4 segments to be inspired. We also know that crisis is an accelerator, and that has happened for all of us, that the trends in church and culture, the shifting change, the increase in the number of folks who have professed no spiritual affiliation or religious affiliation or are done with religion, organized religion, we know that that was on the rise before the pandemic, but the pandemic accelerated and exacerbated the trends that we were seeing. And the good news is we are slowly becoming the post-pandemic church. There is hope. We are slowly becoming the post-pandemic church. Endemic times means living with what we know to be true about how we have to care for ourselves and one another in ways that respect what we learned during this time. And so some of the very good work that congregations are doing now is they're taking a prayerful pause and they're saying, what did we learn? Just like those folks who offered their testimonies and their stories to the Time Capsule Project, what did we learn? What did we learn about ourselves? Where did we find hope? Where did we experience, where did we demonstrate courage, right? On behalf of our communities and on behalf of the church. There's some very good scholarship out there, and I wanted to cover some of the scholarship this morning just to give you a taste of where some of these thoughts and insights and ideas come from. There's some very good scholarship out there on the landscape, and this is some of the best that we have found. We had Todd Balsinger as a leader for an affinity group last September, I believe. And so he did a colloquy and did a presentation to a number of folks, and then there were folks who had attended that presentation who came together as a small group, an affinity group, to learn more about his thoughts, his ideas, his insights about what's happening during this time. Now, his subsequent book to this is the book that basically engaged, which was about leadership in the crucible. What are the things leaders need to know during these types of times? But a lot of the scholarship that he brought to that work came from his first book, which is called Canoeing the Mountains, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory. And some of the key insights from his scholarship in the book, which, by the way, is very easy to read. Each chapter has some good conversation, discussion questions at the end, but he has some really important insights, and he has a real way of putting his finger on the pulse of the cultural landscape, and he knows church inside and out. And he also has a really good way of presenting the insights and scholarship in this particular book, because he uses the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery story to talk about how they really made it to where they were going, and the fact that they got to a critical and pivotal point in their journey, and it was Sacagawea who ended up being the leader, not Lewis or Clark, who had prepared for what they thought was going to be the kind of journey they encountered, and Sacagawea helped guide them through the real journey. So it's pretty interesting, and the key sort of ideas that he presents, you can see here on the screen. The church, the we here is the church. We are in uncharted territory right now, and the old maps no longer serve us. So the things we used to look for to increase our capacity, to increase our effectiveness, and to be successful, all of those maps no longer serve us. He also says that in uncharted territory, trust is essential. And so if there's anything that's happening in the context of a community or in an organization that's undermining trust, your ability to go forward and be impactful is going to be affected by that. He suggests and invites us to think about asking new questions. And I would go one step further. I would suggest that we need to live with the questions. Just like Rilke, the poet, invited a young person that they were mentoring to love the questions themselves, jumping right to the answers doesn't serve any of us well. Living with the questions, digging more deeply in the questions, understanding what underlies the questions, that's really powerful for the work that we're called to do right now. He also says, of course, that win-win solutions are the goal, and that a clear, well-defined mission is essential. How many of you could paraphrase? I'm going to turn my back. Just raise your hands. How many of you could paraphrase the mission of your church? There's no critique or no condemnation here. It is just to say that when we focus our resources, our activities, our volunteer energy, when we focus everything we do both on our unique call and on our mission and living our mission, that's when we're most impactful. He also says that in uncharted territory, our own ongoing transformation is key. And so for any of us, I'm on the faith formation team in my church. That's probably no surprise because I did that work for 30 years, and that's what people consistently ask you to do. I could be a deacon too, but I get recruited to faith formation and Christian education. And, I have to keep learning to be a successful participant in the work of that committee and the work of that team. I can't rely on ideas I used 25 years ago. I have to keep reading. I have to keep learning. I have to keep wondering aloud and asking questions about what best serves the people that we're hoping to serve in our congregation, and how do we effectively make disciples. So another question we might ask in light of this. Oh, no, before you jump ahead, I had something I want. I'm going to give you guys some work to do, right? I can do that, right? Can I step away? I can step away, yeah.
Do you want me to hand something up, or us to hand something up?
No, it's fine. I like to, that feels like so. Lights in my eyes, and,
Are you talking or?
I'll go back up there. I know they're live streaming, but this is a fuller list of Balsinger's Canoeing the Mountains insights. And it's called a reorientation recap. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'm not trying to be the petulant child. So this is a fuller list of some of Balsinger's key insights, and I wanted to hand this to you and give you a couple of minutes to look at it. And then I want you to take a minute to discern what jumps out to you. What on this very comprehensive list of canoeing the mountains, the church in changing times, jumps out to you, and then turn to someone next to you and just talk to them about why that particular insight or that idea was important or may have caught your attention. And I'm going to give you about 5-6 minutes to do this. So find a partner. 5-6 minutes for the whole thing, for looking down the list and then turning to someone and just saying, oh, I thought this was interesting, or I think this is relevant to us, or maybe we need to consider that, okay? You have about 1 more minute. All right, folks, I'm going to ask you to draw your conversations to a close. So for any of you who are winding up your conversations, what are some of the things that jumped out at you? What are some of the things that caught your attention? Anything you're more curious about? Anything that you can say, yes, I agree, or I'm not sure I agree? What jumped out at you?
One thing, and I just said I frankly had never really thought about it in these terms before. It's the third from the bottom there. Those who had neither power nor privilege in the Christendom world are the trustworthy guides and necessary leaders when we go off the map. And, thinking really, of course, first of all, this is a community which is mostly the people with power and privilege, and most of this church is those. Not all, but mostly. And so how do we get these people involved? I don't know.
Thank you, John. I think the first step might be to be engaged with folks, right? And to learn more about some of the things that they're finding joy in and some of the things that are challenging them as well, right? To begin conversations, to show up in the same spaces, to be together, right? In making a difference in your community. That's one good way to begin. That was the point of telling the story and emphasizing this. Sacagawea was the one who led at a certain point, is that insight about it's the folks who are on the margins or who have not had the power and privilege or the luxury of the maps who will lead us in this time. So, thank you. Other things? Oh, thanks, Allison. Thanks for doing that.
Hi, Kristen with a CH, and I both actually honed in on the same one immediately, which is in uncharted territory, vision is accurately seeing ourselves and defining reality. And, sorry, I have a horrible froggy voice all the time. I think we don't see ourselves clearly most of the time. And I think until we can really accurately assess where we are, we can't go anywhere. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I agree.
Okay.
And your name is Kristen with a CH?
Krista.
Oh, Krista. Hi, Krista.
Krista and Priscilla.
Priscilla, Krista, good conversation. Thank you for that insight. There's a lot of wisdom in this room.
I'm Art.
Hi.
So the one that jumped out at me in the whole list here, when our old maps fail us, something within us dies. Yeah. And the word that comes to mind for me is deflated, loss of motivation, loss of energy.
Mm-hmm. Demoralized.
Don't know where, I haven't covered the whole map, and I've been working on journeying on this map. Yeah. And now it's and so there's energy in terms of that exploration of things ahead of me on the map.
Yeah.
No map.
Right.
Deflated.
Yeah. A lot of churches and their leaders report being demoralized, and that comes from working harder at the same strategies and not seeing them take root or be successful the way they were in the old days, right? And so I think there's a joy and a challenge in this, right? The joy is that you pivoted in your statement. You went from how you feel and how you're experiencing that to looking ahead, right? So that's where hope comes from. That's where hope lies. But we're grieving. We're grieving so many things. And we don't do grief well in our culture, folks. If we could do drive-through viewings, and I don't know, somehow I keyed on this idea 20 years ago because I was serving in a local congregation, and grief and grief work was one of the reasons people would seek me out. Their children had experienced a first death, and how do I tell them? How do I help them process this? How do I work through this with them? And in the process of parents learning again about and receiving permission to grieve and to take time and to make the space and to do the very good grief work that we need to do, in the guise of doing that for their children, they were able to do that for themselves. We just have high expectations of ourselves. We have high expectations of others. Of course, these are general statements. But as a culture, that seems to be the way we are. And sometimes we just need to take a prayerful pause, as the executive conference minister, Darrell Goodwin, reminds us and reminds his staff. We need to take a prayerful, and by the way, he sends his greetings today. I meant to say that earlier. We need to take a prayerful pause and be present to what we've lost and name what we've lost. And that will enable us to pivot, like my friend the musician here this morning. You said Mark? Art. Thank you, Art. I'm sorry. Like Art said, it'll enable you to pivot, both as a faith community, as individual people of faith, to take time to be present to our grief and do that very good work, and to name what we've lost, and to name what we're hopeful about will enable us to do this very good work of being impactful churches at this time, and to have an impactful and effective mission and ministry. Time for one more. Kim, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Kim. And perhaps you're going to talk about this, but my question is about how do we stop and do exactly what you're saying? Because one of the questions here talks about how today leadership is learning to ask new questions we've been too scared, too busy, or too proud to ask. Yeah. And my experience in leadership, especially in church, is that we're moving to the next thing. And if we're not moving to the next thing, we are perceived as failing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And nobody wants to fail. Mm-hmm. And frankly, that's what I find exhausting. The thought of asking new questions, no thank you. I am the expert of what I know, and that's where I stay. Yeah. Because I don't have time, I'm too proud, or too busy to learn the next thing. And I love our church. So if that's where I am, how do we make this shift? And I'm not trying to put all of me on all of you, but just to sort of share sort of where I sit, and that one really touches me. Yeah. Because I want to ask the questions, and I have to say, everybody here has given me permission to. It's not that that's not the case, but it's a very difficult shift for me. It is.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for your vulnerability in that comment. I think that, one of the things that Brene Brown celebrates in leadership is when leaders can be vulnerable, right? And we all need to be able to do that at times. I'm I'm grateful for your question. I'm grateful for you saying, well, maybe I don't want to ask new questions. Maybe I don't want to reframe my questions. How do I create this space? I think one key is that we have to remind each other and encourage each other to do it. And I think we have to be careful to manage our expectations. And I think we have to learn together. I think learning together and putting what we understand about these times on a common platform really helps us each to understand, to bring our own experience, to bring our own insights and our own vulnerabilities to what we're learning, and that I believe the Holy Spirit works in that way. And then the work that we do is greater than the sum of its parts. Because that's the reason we're here. That's the reason we take membership covenant. That's the reason we affiliate. We want to be a part of something that works for the common good, right, and makes a difference. And the ways that we do that are not by having really high executive level expectations of one another when that's not possible in the moment, right? It's responding to the moment faithfully and well and being our best authentic selves. So if I have any wisdom to impart, from what I've learned personally in my own journey through serving for local congregations, or having conversations with peers, or reading the latest scholarship. These are the things that we're hearing echoed, right? That leaders have to be willing to be vulnerable, know their values, manage expectations, lean in when that feels like the opposite thing that you want to do. And to be present to one another, to remind one another to forgive. We had a beautiful prayer of confession this morning. We took time in silence. All of these things that we do in worship help us to be better together when we're a community organizing around our mission and ministry and our mission and ministry endeavors and strategies. The hard thing in congregations is to hold people accountable to be in worship, and to have a faith life, and to also lead. And sometimes there's a disconnect there for whatever reason. But creating safe spiritual spaces where people can come and be together prior to a business agenda is a great way to incorporate, is a great simple strategy to incorporate to begin to do some of this work a little more intentionally. Yeah. Hi, Nancy.
Hi there. I really just wanted to react to what Kim was talking about and what you've been talking about. When we started discussing having this session together, we being Allison, Bruce, I, and Karen, traditionally we would jump into what is our mission, how do we shift? And to your point, we don't know where we are today. So we thought to help ground us, to give us the leap, was to understand where not only our church is, but where other churches are, so we could take that next leap, that next step toward the mission of what we are and what we want to be going forward and how we can serve people better. So that's why we kind of shifted the tone of what this might be normally annually to help us open up.
This gentleman over here. Thanks, Allison.
So I'm curious, has there been looked at a comparison between the old map and what may be a new map to see where there is a disconnect? And the old maps can't be without value. And you wonder what part of the old maps might return. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important that we talk in specifics in that regard. Otherwise, we're blue skying or not even gray skying. I think it would be good to look at the old map and see where we went wrong and where it needs to be edited and adjusted.
And I don't think that it's so much, if I could respond, I'll take a minute to respond. Thank you for your question, and thank you for your comment. We are going to shift in a minute, and we will do some of that, But what I want to say in reflection to your comment is that we're not suggesting anyone throw the baby out with the bathwater. What we're suggesting we do is that we take time and intention to understand the shift in the landscape around us, because we're all being impacted by it. We're being affected by it one way or the other, decline in numbers, decline in giving, whatever it might be. Everyone is experiencing the impact for the most part. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. There are some anomalies in that, right? There always are. But it's just like buying a new pair of running shoes. You know, if you're a runner and you've put those shoes on and they've served you well and your feet feel good and your legs feel good and you have energy and you're going, and then, you know, maybe you overpronate a little and so the inner structure of the shoe doesn't fit you as well anymore. It's not serving your running style, or, you know, whatever it might be. And I'm not a runner, but I have plenty of people in my family who do. You know, why would you not buy that new pair of shoes once the old pair had served you well? You might put that special lacing back in the new pair of shoes that you liked so much in the old pair. You might put that little charm in the laces that you liked. And of course, I know a lot of shoes are laceless now, but anyway, we won't even go there. We have to be willing to move off the map, to take what served us best, to look ahead, to discern, take time to discern prayerfully and move forward. And how we do that, there's so many resources, tools available to you. But it's, you know, the work that you will do is unique to you. You are a unique faith community in a community, a wider community of over 600 faith communities in southern New England. But your church has its own unique call. You are positioned and poised in your community in a unique way. And so for you to, whether you're looking at a new map or whether you were trying to use an old map, you know, to just use the map as the only or single guide for what you're doing isn't going to serve us well either. Looking ahead, what are the new maps? What can we take from the old maps? What do we want to leave behind? This has been a time of permission giving to leave some things behind that has been very unburdening to some congregations, because they've been able to embrace something new because they've left something that wasn't working behind, something that, you know, to Art's point earlier, just became something that was too difficult to deal with. Let's have the next slide. Thank you for your comment. Your name is? Bruce. Oh, you're Bruce? Bruce, is your hair longer than it used to be? Hi, Bruce. So these are the ways we're reframing some of the questions, and I'm going to have you talk to your neighbor again in a few minutes. But so another question to ask is, what are the faithful next steps a church can take to maintain and deepen its purpose through these times? And in order to answer this question, you have to answer your why, right? You have to know what your purpose is. You have to be pretty articulate with your purpose. It has to be something that you agree on, something that energizes and inspires you all, something that, you know, is a signpost that you're able to hold out in front of you. As Simon Sinek said, is what is your why, right? What is your purpose? So orienting yourself in the landscape or on the map, Bruce, is an important thing to do, right? Orienting yourself with that map, right? Go ahead. These are some balcony questions that churches are invited to ask when it's a time to reimagine their vision or reimagine their purpose. But this is also a level-setting set of questions, right? It helps us to sort of just pause for a moment and say, where are we now? Where are we going? And where is God leading us? Or, of course, another way of saying that was the question I asked earlier. What is God's preferred future for our church? Go ahead. So, Jeffrey Jones, who was an American Baptist pastor and leader who taught at Andover Newton for many years, has suggested examples of questions that lead toward adaptive change, because that's what we're all really struggling with. What is the adaptive change our congregation or our community needs to make to be as impactful and effective in our mission and ministry as we can be? And so new questions for a new day do these three things, right? They help us to imagine the future that God intends, help us to focus on what's possible, and enable us to come together in discernment. Discernment is a spiritual practice. It's one we're not practiced in. Maybe individually in our own faith lives and our own faith journeys, we've got it. We're listening for the still small voice. We know how we perceive that. It could be in the voice of a friend. It could be in feeling a totally new feeling about using my own gifts and passions in a community setting. There are many ways that we do our individual discernment as disciples. But we're not as good at communal discernment as we could be. We've lost the ability, in some ways, to practice communal discernment. Go ahead. And so Jeff Jones says that questions that lead toward adaptive change are not the questions we're all always asking ourselves, right? These are the questions, right? How do we deal with this internal conflict? How do we become financially sustainable? How do we increase our membership? Rather, he suggests that we ask questions that lead toward adaptive change this way. What might happen if we create a new vision for our church? Knowing our values and our purpose, what might happen if we create a new vision for our church? How might we imagine new ways to utilize our space, our campus, our buildings? How does the community know what you do here on Sunday mornings or Wednesday afternoons or evenings? If you ask someone in the community, what would you miss about our church if we were no longer here? What would they say? And how do we increase our community engagement? What might happen if we increase our community engagement? Jeff goes on to say, rather than asking, how do we bring people in, we should be asking ourselves how we send them out. Rather than asking, what should the pastor do, we should say, what is our shared ministry together? Rather than asking, what's our vision and how do we implement it, what's God up to and how do we get on board? How do we join God in the neighborhood? Rather than how do we survive, how do we serve? Rather than how do we save or help people, how do we make the reign of God and the way of living like Jesus more present and powerful in this time and place? Just living for a year or 6 months with one of these reframed questions that leads toward adaptive change has helped many congregations get out of their stuckness, because we all get stuck from time to time. Of course, the pandemic shook us up a little. That goes without saying. But as we think and reason and imagine living in endemic times, this shift toward asking adaptive questions that lead toward adaptive change is really going to be key to our success in the future. So let's go. I'm going to give you some signposts and strategies now for changing times. And some of this you've heard already in the presentation this morning, so there's a little bit of a recap. And then we're going to move on to think about what folks are saying about leading in a time of liminality. But first of all, The important premises that we're using for this conversation this morning are that the old maps and attractional models are no longer viable. There may be some viability in the strategies that were part of the old maps, but the old maps are no longer viable. That vital congregations do exist in all shapes and sizes, and I'm here to affirm that. And that it's essential that we know our neighbors and ask ourselves, what is God up to in the neighborhood? So Susan Beaumont, who talks a lot about the liminality of this time and leading in a liminal space, has written a book, Where to Lead, or How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, Leading in a Liminal Space. And she was a perennial and a premier consultant to congregations through an organization called Alban Institute, which offered us a lot of scholarship in 3 or 4 decades and a lot of the premier thinkers of effective mission and ministry in the life of the local church. And Susan Beaumont has led congregations through many conversations about reimagining their mission and ministry. But she talks about this time of liminality and what is a liminal space. If I asked you, what does liminal mean? What is liminality? What would you say? That's honest, Kim. Thank you very much. The space in between? A threshold? Do you know Carrie Newcomer? She's a singer-songwriter. She does some beautiful music, very spiritual music, very spiritual person. She's also a poet. And she has written this about liminality. So much of what we know lives just below the surface. Half of a tree spreads out beneath our feet, living simultaneously in 2 worlds, each half informing and nurturing the whole. A tree is either and neither, but mostly both. And then I'm going to skip ahead, and I am going to send Allison a link to the full poem. There are endings and beginnings, one emerging out of the other, and most days as I travel, in an ever-present and curious now, a betwixt and between that is almost, but not quite, the beautiful, but not yet. I've been learning to live with what is, more patient with the process, to love what is becoming, and the questions that keep returning. So liminal space, liminal times are times of ambiguity and disorientation, times of moving forward without a clear vision of what is emerging. Father Richard Rohr writes on liminal spaces. Go ahead. Thanks, Craig. That liminal times are anxious and ambiguous days that might offer up the most holy of gifts. He reminds us that there's gift in this time, that there's something to be discovered, something to learn, something to propel our hope forward, something to inspire. He also says that liminal space, therefore, is a unique spiritual position where human beings hate to be. We don't like not knowing where we're going. We don't like seeing the end goal. We don't like ambiguity. But, he says about these times, that's where the biblical God always leads us. That's where the biblical God leads us. Think about some of those stories from the Hebrew text. Amazing. And that all transformation takes place in liminal spaces. So Susan points us to 4 things to remember. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dana.
Thank you. You've teed up some prompts to get us to think about where we are and where we're going, but then we've moved to the next slide rather quickly. And I think it's getting me stuck and maybe everybody else in the room, is I don't think we're all coming from the same place. And these kinds of discussions assume we are. So we're stuck, because I don't really know where he's coming from, and I don't really know where he's coming. I can guess. I don't know. And in the kinds of planning sessions that I've been part of, we've divided up into groups. Here's an example. There's a group of us, maybe, that are really worried about the future vitality of this church. And we might go to the right side of the room. And there's a group who's really hopeful about the vitality of the church, and they have the reason. And then we have to convince each other. But then we're going to know where we are along a continuum, and we could help each other move towards some kind of consensus about where we are, where we want to go. But I don't think we're getting there yet.
Well, it's not going to happen in a single presentation, I can guarantee you that, Dana. And what I'm hoping to do today is plant seeds that will offer you opportunities to have those conversations. The wisdom of dividing yourselves to understand where people stand and come back together, there are lots of ways to do that without making that so visible. I think we have enough division in our culture these days. But I think knowing where people stand and what's important to them and what concerns them is valuable. And that's why I think asking some of these new questions and reframing some of the questions we've been asking is going to be valuable. Let's have some conversation, Dana. We're not going to get in small groups, but I'm having to turn to another neighbor. Let's have some conversation about the importance of what we need to remember in liminal time and liminal spaces, and this is based on Susan Beaumont's work. So the first thing she says, what are the opportunities of liminal spaces? Because there are opportunities at this time. The first opportunity is to remember community. Remember the values inherent in community. To cherish community and seek a community that supports and nurtures you. And to remember that relationships matter. So I want you to talk to your neighbor for about 2 minutes and tell me, or tell one another, and then you can tell me, how you know that in this church, relationships matter. How do you demonstrate that to one another? How do you know here that relationships matter, that community matters? You can talk amongst yourselves, and you have 2 minutes. All right, folks, 30 seconds. All right, turning to the front. Does anyone have something they want to offer for the good of the whole? What did you say about relationships and community? Some folks are deep in it, Allison.
I know.
It's a good thing.
They're relating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're relating.
Yeah.
Anything you want to offer or share? Go ahead, Janet.
Was that a, Mark, was that a hand mark?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
You were just waving.
Well, I'm looking at that community relationships matter, maybe jumping ahead a little bit. We did end up talking a bit about what would the comment in the community be if our church weren't here. And I can remember being at some other gathering someplace where it was mentioned that in some cases people might say, where? Oh, you mean that big building at the top of the hill where the doors are always closed? And that is not what you would hear in the community about this church, because it is quite open to the community and has really historically and today wanted to be there to serve. And I loved your line about not ask how we can survive, but ask how we can be of service.
Thank you, Janet. Anything else on relationships?
I'm going to just interject there because Janet reminds me of something that you all may experience here and there, but when I run into folks from the 12-step groups, they repeatedly remind me how deeply connected they feel with y'all and with this church. And that's a relationship that's very real. For some, it's been life-saving, but we don't necessarily hear about it. It's not those faces that we see when we walk in on Sunday morning and feel those warm fuzzies, but it's so genuine. And I always feel very grateful when I run into someone in the hall and they can say, I just want to tell you how grateful we are for Saugatuck Church. So there's a whole other layer of relationship that
Absolutely.
is there.
One of my following questions was going to be, how does a seeker or someone who's a visitor know that relationships matter to you? So thinking about relationships and community on those many levels is something that we should always be doing, right? It should be a way of ongoing discernment, especially as we're thinking about preparing to welcome folks, to grow membership, to bring people in the doors, you have to be prepared to do that, right? And, I've been to some churches, I've visited some congregations where you come down to a room like this for coffee hour, and, I've even got a name tag on that says, and people are so busy catching up with one another, and so busy talking to one another, and so engrossed and involved in their own conversations, that I may not get a greeting. I may not get a passing comment. And if I didn't have this name tag on, and I had that experience, what would that be like, right? Right? So digging down, asking those questions, and who, in addition to our faith community, our covenant membership, are we in relationship with, who thinks of us as their community, right? Because there are so many people. We talk to small congregations all the time who are at the top of a green, in a rural community or a smaller suburban community, and because they have a tall white steeple and someone may have come here for a wedding or a funeral at one point in time, that person believes that they're connected to that congregation. And so they might find out that congregation, because there's a big hole in the ground outside, that congregation has to put a new septic system in. And somebody just stops and says, I really appreciate you being here, and writes a check and hands it to the pastor. But we're so unaware of these things, and we're so unaware. And these are the things we need to become more aware of. Thank you. I think I'm going to have to jump along. I'm looking at time. I'm sorry. Thanks, Craig. So be the change, right? Gandhi, be the change you wish to see in the world. Another opportunity of liminal space is innovation and being open to experimentation and being willing to take risks and being flexible and thinking about reimagining and reinvention and what that looks like. The pandemic has taught us some of this, and that's why I find those resiliency time capsule stories so powerful and so inspirational. I would just ask you for 1 minute to turn to a partner. Find somebody different, as a matter of fact. Go talk to somebody different and celebrate one thing that you did that was innovative or creative during the pandemic as a church. What do you celebrate? Because this is not just about saying, oh, woe is me, look at us. We're not as shiny as that church over there on that hill. It's about figuring out what you celebrate, what you cherish, what matters to you in the mission and ministry of this church. So turn to someone and tell them what you celebrate, or go find somebody else. Okay. Thank you. It's always a fine line between you don't want it in your face and you feel like you have to bend over,
Well,
right?
I noticed you bending over, so that's why I wanted
Thanks,
to
Craig.
remove that temptation.
Thank you.
That's it better?
Thank you. All right, you're going to be frustrated because time is up. But I would invite you to continue the conversation that we're having. What do you celebrate? I'll take 2 answers. What do you celebrate?
Oh, I just talked to, I'm sorry. I was recalling that, I think a lot of churches managed quickly to go to the streaming, but I'm ever so grateful that we did it so fast. But we had a confirmation class that was done via Zoom. And I think it would have been so easy to just say, well, we can't do the normal confirming. You know, they'd all been meeting up until March, and then they couldn't meet together.
Yeah.
And they cleverly figured out taking a ball of yarn from one home to the other, but at the end of each of the little shots, you saw them tossing the ball of yarn, and so that technically they were tied together, and it was really powerful.
Isn't that amazing? I saw young people passing candles to one another on Zoom. I saw young people celebrating so many different things. And they respond to the environment in a way because it's natural to them, right? They're natives to technology. People in my generation are not. And so I'm an immigrant. They are native to the technology, and they made that pivot quickly. And it enabled them to maintain their community, which is so important to them. So kudos to you guys for having confirmation on Zoom. That's awesome. One more thing, anybody? Something you celebrate?
This was Priscilla's. I heard it on both sides.
So walking, we organized, or Allison organized walks so that we actually got to see each other and be with each other. And we would go to all the beaches, and it was wonderful. It used to be about, 25 people? It was great.
So why let go of some of these things? To my friend Bruce's earlier point, not everything, right, from the old map doesn't work, and not everything from the new map needs to be set aside because we're no longer physical distancing or wearing masks, right? We're making new maps as we go, right? We're plotting a course as we seek aliveness together. We're plotting a course together. 2 more things she says. What's essential? Reclaiming your core values. What are your core values? Nancy, I would love you to take that question into a meeting. What are our core values? And how do we know these are our values? That's the essential second step of the question, right? And another opportunity of liminal space is cultivating collective wisdom and storytelling and testimony. And again, I'll say it one more time. The resiliency time capsule, that's what that is. It was an opportunity in liminal space during a pandemic time, and it's a beautiful testimony. Yeah. So we're looking at formation and mission in liminal spaces, and it looks different. It looks different. We're taking walks together. I hope you're still taking walks together. Take those walks. Take the time to take those walks. Because we're not going back to normal. What is, that's right, Priscilla. What exactly? We all have our own perception of what that is, right? We all have our own thinking about what that should look like. But if we don't talk to one another, we don't negotiate these waters together. What is normal? And if we're not going back, where are we going? Well, we need to know where we are. So I said, remember a little bit about this conversation today is seed planting and level setting. I bet you didn't know there was a bell curve for the life cycle of a church, right? But if you've seen one, raise your hand, because there's probably about 100 different models, so some of you have done this work. I have a paper for all of you based on this model. Which explains the stages and the phases, and they're not probably going to be as clear on this slide as they are on the paper. So, but when communities or organizations, you could apply this to a faith community of any kind. It doesn't have to be a Christian community. You can apply it to an organization. You can apply it to many different ways. This life cycle, this bell curve, shows the stages of both congregations as they begin or reimagine themselves significantly, or as they prepare for completion of ministry. And it's all about what you do and how intentional you are in doing it in the peak of the bell curve, right? So that peak is called sustained health. And many places, after having done all this beautiful work as a launch for a new community or a relaunch of a community, experience momentum growth. There's early adopters, people get excited, people are inspired, people come along, there's just a natural affiliation to that, right? Something new is happening and people get all excited. And then as we see this growth happen, we have to plan to manage that growth, right? So we have to be strategic about it. We have to think about, what does our governance look like? What does our organizational management look like? What does our staffing model look like? All of those things, right? And then we get to sustained health and we go, I'm feeling pretty good. And we pat ourselves on the back, which we should. And we feel really good about what we've done, which we should. But the thing we can't do is rest on our laurels. right? So what do we do in sustained health? Well, we think about what's helping us to sustain this health. And during this time, what would help us to continue to grow our mission and ministry? And I don't mean just growth in numbers, I mean growth in impact as well. So I'm not just talking about a numeric measurement, I'm talking about a measurement of impact as well. What would help us to do that? Well, if we aren't intentional about asking those questions and doing that work in the time of sustained health, it becomes really easy to slide down the right side of the bell curve. And early in maintenance, we might not even know we're in maintenance. We might not even realize that's what's happening, but something doesn't feel quite right. The little things start to matter more. The little things might even become more conflictual. But if we stay in maintenance too long, we're in danger of sliding down to preservation and then completion of ministry. Now, I'm here to tell you there's no shame in completion of ministry because we have several small congregations who are doing some very faithful and intentional work right now about completing their ministry. There's nowhere else in the United States of America in mainline Christianity where congregations celebrate 425-year anniversaries. There isn't. The shadow side of that is that we're not used to churches opening and closing. But in other parts of the country, there are. There are parts of the country, like California, if you go out to the West Coast, they get all excited about celebrating a 75-year anniversary. There are congregations that are excited about celebrating their 5th anniversary. Churches are being born and completing their ministry all the time. We just don't see it here because we're steeped in a part of the country in which our particular tradition developed around, the communities developed around who we were. And our spaces, our places of gathering, were the places where the community gathered. We have a very unique history and perspective to take a look at it. And it's something to celebrate, but there's also a shadow side to that if we're not aware of it. I would love to do more work with you on the life cycle of the church. I would love for you to do more work. I will send you this image. I can't do that today. Time is waning, folks. But I want you to take a peek. Tell me where you are. Tell your leadership where you think you are. Talk to one another. Go ahead. Because perhaps you're a threshold church. And this is the work that threshold churches have to do. If you're in sustained health and you're teetering on a threshold, this is what you have to do. You have to stretch yourselves by focusing on a new vision for the future. You have to answer that values question. You have to rename your why and your purpose, and you have to think about aligning all of your resources around that vision, right? You have to name your new sense, you have to name and renew your sense of call. Remember I said every congregation has its own unique call? That's the work to do at a threshold moment. And when we do that work and we do it well, it enables us, again, to discern well how all of our resources are going to be allocated. Our financial resources, our facility resources, our staffing, our volunteers, all can be refocused to fulfill our new call and vision. And in the act, will be multiplied. So have you focused on vitality? Go ahead. Drat, you knew that was going to happen. Have we taken steps to renewal? If not, can we identify the barriers? It's not that the barriers can't be overcome, but we have to think more creatively when we approach a barrier, right? And how can the barriers be either overcome or removed? That's the question. So it's time to press reset right? A path to sustainability is seldom a straight line, just something to remember and know. You're going to have disparate threads and pieces of work that you do as you do this development work together. And then later in the process, you're going to bring those threads together and you're going to begin to see the whole, right? Longevity and sustainability are not the same thing. Are you planning for longevity or are you planning for sustainability? Key question to ask yourselves. And wise leaders do not go down the path of reset alone. Go ahead. There are some places I'm not going to get to cover much at this point in time. It's 1:14. But I do just want to remind you, if you could go ahead, because we've talked about some of these things. That we need to look at our capacity. When we're doing this work and we're bringing these threads together and we're thinking about creating a new whole, we need to look at our capacity. How many people do we really have who want to bring their gifts and resources to do the work, who are inspired, who are energized by these conversations and what we're looking at in terms of plotting a future path for ourselves, and how can we use those gifts and resources and abilities wisely? And how can we protect people's energies without overburdening them? Right? Because folks say that we're living in a time of blessed disruption. This is a maze. Let me tell you about a maze. This note didn't print. Let me tell you about a maze. Craig, can you jump ahead one slide and then go back? Yeah. Jump ahead one slide, and then go back. This is a maze, not a labyrinth. A maze confuses, a labyrinth does not. Our goal is to move through this time as if we were walking a labyrinth and not a maze. In a labyrinth walk, we give ourselves over to every part of the path ahead of us. In a maze, we become increasingly confused, disoriented, discouraged, and complacent. Oh, I don't want to finish. I'm in a corn maze. Point me to the door, please. I want to go get my apples at the apple barrel. On a labyrinth, we retrace our steps in order to deepen our experience and understanding. In a maze, we may encounter an experience of the same barriers we encountered earlier without having gained a sense of direction or orientation. The concept of sustaining while disrupting, which is the work we're called to in this liminal time. We're called to the work of sustaining while disrupting. The concept of sustaining while disrupting is like following the labyrinth, not walking through a maze. It's important to walk in each time with a new intention, and to walk out each time, inspired by the experience of finding our center on a labyrinth, right? So let's talk a brief bit about sustaining and disrupting. That's where I was going. May I have 5 more minutes of your time? Okay. You're going to jump ahead 2 slides. 2 slides. So I have some materials I'm going to leave with your leaders, Bruce and Nancy. 2 of these are mission insight reports. These reports are abbreviated reports of longer reports that you can get through a tool called Mission Insight. Mission Insight is available to you through the Southern New England Conference because we are a subscribing conference. And they use a variety of studies, including the 2020 American Belief Studies, to say a little bit to people in local churches who want to know what's going on about the people in their community and their area and how they have responded to these research tools and these surveys. For instance, I can tell you that people in your community believe strong families are a key to social stability. And I can tell you that people in your community believe America has a moral responsibility to be a force for good in the world. And I can tell you that people in your community have very little trust for religious institutions. Right? So how do we take these insights? How do we take this information and put it to our best use, right? Because it's not all about starting with statistics. It's not all about the statistics, but the data matters. It's one of those threads that I talked about that we bring together, right? Declining median worship attendance among U.S. congregations in 2000, I can't even say that anymore, 2000? Gosh, in 2000, the average median attendance in a local congregation was 137. Today, it's 65. That's a national statistic through the American Beliefs. Oh no, this is actually a fact study. So I was telling Dana earlier, because she was asking about facts and statistics, and I believe that they have a place and they're important, that we have at the Harvard International University for Religion and Peace, which is the former Harvard Seminary, something called the Harvard Institute for Religion Research. And they collaborate in this fact study. And this is the fact overview, 20 years of congregational change, the 2020 Faith Communities Study. I'm going to hand it to Nancy when I'm done today. But there are many things in here for you to be aware of. And that will inform your work if you decide to undertake the task of doing this development work together. Here's on page 13 a table that shows a consistent story of worsening attendance over time. Before the pandemic, we knew that if people were gone for 3 weeks, they were gone. And what did the pandemic do to that? Right? And what are our strategies? Do we go looking for the lost sheep? Or do we get busy about planning our future? Or do we do both and? So Nancy, I'm going to ask you to come forward. I'm going to hand these to you because I can't refer to them much more today. But I want to talk for 1 minute come on up. Before we leave, I want to talk to you a little bit about sustaining while disrupting, because that's the work that we're doing. That's the work that we're called to. And that's the work that feels pretty uncomfortable in this liminal time, in this liminal space. Nope, you're going back to the former slide. Yep, thanks. F. Douglas Powe, P-O-W-E, and Lovett Weems, Jr., whose name is pretty familiar to church development folks, have just written a book called Sustaining While Disrupting, and it has a lot to offer us. Because again, I'm going to pick on Bruce. Are you okay with that, Bruce? Because to Bruce's point earlier about the old maps and the new maps, part of what we're called to do is this sort of dance of sustaining while disrupting. That's why I asked you what you celebrate, because your answers matter in terms of what you want to sustain in the current mission and ministry of your church, right? Why would you give up something you celebrate? But the disruption comes because of the changing cultural landscape, because some of the statistics that Nancy has in her hands, because of the things we know are happening. And a blessed disruption, an inspired disruption, is to be innovative while we're sustaining the best of what we have going forward. And we can only do that by understanding these concepts, by talking to one another, by reframing our questions, and by being willing to have these conversations, to grieve together what we have to say goodbye to, and to remind ourselves to be open to what we might embrace and what might surprise us. And that's all I can say today, folks. I'm going to send you this PowerPoint. Thank you for your time. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for this space today, and especially for time in worship this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. I suspect that if you have something that you want to ask while Karen's packing up, you can go ahead and tug on her sleeve.
Absolutely.
Blessings to everybody on your afternoon.